If I were to ask you to name the world's de facto states, which would you list? Kosovo, Palestine, Taiwan, Somaliland, Abkhazia, Northern Cyprus, Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh? What about Kurdistan, Scotland, or the Donetsk People's Republic? Perhaps you'd say all of them. More probably you'd just say some of them. And what about the ones I didn't list? In this video, I'm going to take a look at how we understand the term de facto state and explain why it's so difficult to say exactly which territories should and shouldn't be thought of as de facto states. Hello, my name is James Ker-Lindsay. Welcome to Independent Thinking, a channel dedicated to international relations, secession, independence, and the origins of countries. De facto states, otherwise known as contested states, unrecognized states, or partially recognized states, have become a source of fascination for those interested in international politics. They exist on the very fringes of the international community, territories that want to be seen as countries and in some cases have a very strong claim to statehood but haven't yet gained full international acceptance. However, while the concept of de facto states is easy enough to grasp, producing a definitive list of the world's de facto states is in fact remarkably difficult. The problem is that while it might seem a relatively easy idea to grasp, it's extremely difficult to pinpoint which territories can and should be properly regarded as de facto states. The one thing everyone can agree on is that the term covers entities that have a certain state-like quality but aren't yet members of the United Nations. Beyond that, as we'll see, there's actually precious little agreement on which territories qualify. On the face of it, the simplest way to define a de facto state would be to take the Montevideo criteria as a starting point and then consider any territory that meets that threshold but is not yet a member of the United Nations as a de facto state. However, while this might seem the obvious way of approaching things, in reality all sorts of other considerations come into the picture. For a start, although a defined territory, settled population, government and the ability to enter into international relations are the absolute requirements of statehood, some seem to believe that these can or should be treated in a slightly different way when it comes to de facto states. For example, the question of territory and territorial control can be extremely contentious. Most observers would argue that Western Sahara and Palestine should be regarded as de facto states. Both enjoy a high degree of international recognition. Western Sahara as a member of the African Union and Palestine as a non-member observer state at the United Nations. However, others have argued that while both certainly exist as ideas and have a defined territory and settled population, their governments don't exercise effective control throughout the greater proportion of their claimed territory, and so they don't really qualify as de facto states. And what about the question of independent governance? As I've noted, the conception of government under the Montevideo Convention has tended to be more precisely understood in recent years as government free from direct and overarching external control. While some de facto states can be understood to be effectively independent of foreign control, more usually this isn't strictly the case. For example, do South Ossetia and Abkhazia really exercise fully independent government, or are they essentially subject to Russian control, even though Moscow formally recognises them as independent states? The same applies to Northern Cyprus. Can it be regarded as wholly independent from Turkey? Many would argue that while Abkhazia and Northern Cyprus certainly do rely on an external power for their security and even their very existence, they in fact exercise far more independent day-to-day government over their territory than many realise or are willing to acknowledge. In this sense, many argue that given their aspiration to formal independence, they should be considered de facto states. This debate becomes all the more heated when it comes to the emergence of the breakaway territories in Ukraine. Some see the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, which declared independence from Ukraine in 2014, as de facto states, or at least as de facto states in the making. However, to others, these are merely Russian proxy entities under the direct control of Moscow. They aren't really states, and therefore they have no genuine claim to de facto statehood, at least as things stand. I hope to return to this fascinating question of the relationship between de facto states and their patrons in a future video. Likewise, the ability to enter into international relations also comes into the equation. While some would see a degree of international recognition and thus the ability to forge formal ties with recognising states as an element to consider, this often ignores the underlying factors behind the recognition of these territories. Recognition is fundamentally a political act. Although it can be driven by an objective appraisal of a territory's ability to meet the terms of the Montevideo criteria, it can equally be extended simply because the political leaders of a state felt like doing it. For instance, South Ossetia has the ability to enter into relations with other states because of its recognition by a handful of countries acting under Russian pressure. Conversely, although Somaliland has no international recognition, it clearly has the ability to enter into relations with other states. And as I've noted, it has contact with a number of countries, including at the highest levels of the British government. Comparing the two, is South Ossetia's claim to de facto statehood on the basis of formal recognition really greater than Somaliland's? Meanwhile, some territories that are widely considered to be de facto states, such as Nagorno-Karabakh and Transnistria, have no formal recognition, even from their patron states, and appear to have minimal formal diplomatic contacts with the outside world. All this makes deciding the process of defining which territories qualify as de facto states very difficult indeed. However, trying to work out which territories constitute de facto states and which don't doesn't quite end there. It gets a little harder. On top of the formal Montevideo criteria, there are a couple of other factors that tend to confuse the picture even more. For example, do we include territories that clearly aspire to statehood but haven't formally declared independence? For example, there are many who consider the Kurdish region of Iraq as a de facto state. By all accounts, it does meet the necessary criteria for statehood. However, it hasn't as yet declared independence. It is still formally a part of Iraq. And while it might make sense to think of it as a de facto state, should we then consider other territories in a similar position as de facto states? Couldn't Scotland be considered a de facto state according to this criteria? And then there's Taiwan. Although this is often included in lists of de facto states, it hasn't declared independence, nor does it officially aspire to independent statehood. Instead, as I explained in another video, it's a wholly different type of dispute based on competing claims to government, rather than a case of secession. However, despite this, Taiwan is nevertheless often counted as a de facto state. Not because it claims to want statehood, but simply because it effectively seems to exist as one. The subject of de facto states is fascinating. However, it's also marred in confusion and disagreement. Just as there's been deep divisions over terminology, there are also fundamental differences over which territories ought to be understood as de facto states and which shouldn't. Some observers take a very broad approach and include any territory that openly or tacitly aspires to independence and has a degree of control, however small, over a piece of territory. Others take a far more restrictive view, arguing that the term should only be applied to those territories that have formally declared independence and can meet the terms of the Montevideo Convention, including the existence of truly independent statehood. Ultimately, the term de facto state is highly subjective. There isn't universal agreement on which territories qualify, nor is there ever likely to be. While some territories, such as Somaliland, Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, Northern Cyprus, Taiwan, Abkhazia and Kosovo, to name just a few, will tend to make most lists, there's far from a consensus on this. Instead, almost everyone will have their own views on what territories should be considered as de facto states and which shouldn't. So which territories would you include in a list of de facto states? Let me know in the comments below. If you found that interesting, here are some suggestions for some other videos you might enjoy, and do consider giving this video a like or sharing it. It all helps the channel to grow. Thanks so much for watching, and see you again soon.